The prairie wakes in silence. A thin light seeps across the horizon, pale as a ghost's breath, touching the broken fence posts that lean tired into the soil. Wind drifts through them like it remembers the sound of better days, rattling wire that hums like a sorrowful fiddle string. The air is sharp with morning chill, yet heavy with a stillness that feels older than time itself. In the yard of a weather-beaten cabin, a woman moves with the slowness of someone who has taught her body not to betray pain. She lifts damp laundry from a wooden bucket, her hands trembling, her knuckles split and raw. The cloth slips once, and she bites her lip before the sound escapes, for sound is dangerous here. She pins a shirt to the line, then another, her eyes scanning the cabin door as if a shadow might leap from it at any moment. Her body wears its quiet map of bruises, hidden beneath sleeves, beneath silence, beneath the practiced bow of her head. The prairie wind carries no pity. It only whispers secrets across the land, carrying the story of her suffering like dust swirling at dawn. She does not speak it, but the land knows, the wind knows, the morning knows. She had not chosen this life. Long ago, when she was still young and soft with dreams, she was given away. A man took her, not for love, not for kindness, but because she was seen as less, a burden to be carried by someone else's back. He never looked at her as if she were whole. From the first night, she learned that his hand would not be gentle, that his voice cut sharper than barbed wire stretched across dry earth. He struck not only her flesh, but her spirit. A spilled cup, a misplaced word, even the silence of her breathing became reason enough for his anger to fall on her like the crack of a whip. Yet she endured, not because she believed she deserved it, but because two small souls came into her life, needing her breath, her arms, her quiet strength. She bore each wound, each night of cruelty, with the stubborn faith that if she stood between him and the children, the blows would land on her instead of them. Her heart was a shield no one could see. The children learned early that Mama was strong, but they also learned to read her silence. They knew when her hands shook as she stirred the pot, when her shoulders tightened at the sound of boots on the porch. They watched with wide, solemn eyes when she flinched at the slam of a door. In their little hearts, they understood what words could not carry. And still, they clung to her, two lanterns of warmth in the storm-dark nights, whispering into her tired arms, "Mama, we're here." Her world was not only suffering, though it often seemed so. There were nights when she hummed them to sleep, her voice soft as the prairie grass in summer winds. There were mornings when she smoothed their hair and smiled through her pain, giving them the illusion of safety, if only for a moment. In their laughter, she found her reason to breathe another day. Far across the plain, beyond her reach, another life moved slow beneath the same sun. A cowboy rode alone, his shadow stretching long across the land. He was a man who had buried more memories than he had ever spoken aloud, whose silence was deeper than wells dug into dry earth. His horse was his only companion, steady and patient, carrying him through days that bled into nights without witness. Folks in town whispered of him. Strange, they said. Quiet, too quiet. A man who kept to himself, who slept under the stars when there was a bed waiting in the saloon. But there was something in him they did not see. His solitude was not hardness, but gentleness misplaced. His eyes, though seldom lifted, carried a softness when they landed upon the few things that mattered. The curve of a river at dusk, the flicker of firelight, and once, the figure of a woman at the well. She had been there fetching water, her children at her side. He had seen her pause, the way she winced when the heavy bucket tugged at her arms. He had noticed the shadow of bruises where her sleeve slipped back. He had looked at her children, who clung close, protective in their smallness. He had not spoken. He had only watched, and something in his chest, long dormant, stirred like a buried seed remembering rain. Rumors carried to his ears. He heard them in saloons, on the trail, in the way men smirked when her husband's name was spoken. He tucked those whispers away, not for gossip, but because he could not stop thinking of her face, pale and tired, yet lined with quiet defiance. And she, though she pretended not to notice, felt his eyes sometimes. Not the way other men looked at her, stripping her down to shame, but differently. as though he was searching not for what was broken, but for what had survived. The prairie carried them both, two lonely souls bound by silence, circling the edges of one another's lives like distant stars. Neither yet knew what path the wind would carve, only that the horizon felt heavy with something unspoken. That night, after the chores were done and the children lay curled against one another, she endured another storm. His anger came like it always did, sudden, senseless, sharp as iron striking stone. She bore it without a cry, without a plea, for she had learned long ago that sound only fed his rage. When at last he slept, his breath thick with liquor, she crept outside. The land was hushed beneath a silver moon. She sank to the ground, her body aching, her soul trembling. She looked up at that pale light, as if it might carry her prayers to a place where pain could not reach. Her lips did not move, but in her heart she whispered the question she had never dared. Was there a life where a hand did not strike, where love was not a weapon, where she could be more than silent endurance? The prairie gave no answer, only the soft rustle of grass, the sigh of wind through broken fence posts, and the endless, indifferent stars. The sun was higher now, harsh and unrelenting, when she made her way to the well with the bucket clutched tight in her aching hands. The children lingered close, their small feet dragging, their eyes heavy with sleeplessness. She lowered the rope, listened to the groan of wood and iron, and pulled with slow strength that tore at muscles long worn by labor and bruises. The bucket slipped, her hands trembling more than usual, and she stumbled back a step. A shadow moved then, tall and quiet, and before she could fall the weight of another hand steadied her arm. His touch was unlike anything she had known, firm but careful, as though her bones were glass, as though he feared even his gentleness might cause harm. She flinched, instinctive, pulling back with a quickness that came from years of learning to shield herself. Her eyes darted up, ready to see the familiar scowl, but instead met the calm gaze of the cowboy. His face was weathered from sun and solitude, his jaw lined with days of dust and silence, yet his eyes carried no violence. He said nothing, the space between them filled with a quiet that spoke louder than words ever could. She clutched her arm to her chest, lowering her gaze, and he stepped back with respect, as if to tell her he asked nothing, expected nothing. The children tugged her skirts, sensing her unease, and she gathered herself quickly, lifting the bucket and moving away with the stiff grace of someone who could not allow herself to tremble where others could see. But the silence he left behind stayed with her. Days later, she found the broken boards of her fence neatly mended. No knock on the door, no voice calling attention to the work, only the sound of wood resting stronger than before. When she woke one morning, a sack of flour leaned against a stoop, tied tight, no note left, only the mark of boot prints that faded into the dirt road. It was not the work of neighbors. Neighbors did not give without talk, without rumor. The children noticed first. Their eyes brightened when they saw the fence hole, when their bellies filled with bread she had not expected to make. They whispered in their small voices, "Mama." It was him. They did not call him by name, for to them he was only the quiet cowboy who sometimes looked at them as if they mattered. Her heart resisted the thought. No man was different. She had been given to one who promised to provide, and all she had received were scars. Hope was dangerous. Hope made the fall sharper, the wound deeper. Yet even as she told herself not to believe, her chest ached with something she had not felt in years. She watched once from the edge of the field as he rode past. His horse moved slow, as though it too carried a heart that understood the weight of sorrow. He tipped his hat slightly, not out of arrogance, but as acknowledgement, the way one honors the rising of the sun. She turned quickly, unable to let him see her linger. But her hands trembled all evening, not from fear this time, but from something more fragile. When she caught him showing her boy how to tie a rope, when she saw her daughter laugh freely beside him, she felt her chest seize. The sound of their laughter was so unfamiliar it startled her. She wanted to pull them back, shield them, keep them close. For what if this kindness was only a trick of the wind, here today and gone tomorrow? She had lived too long in the shadow of cruelty to believe that gentleness could last. At night she sat by the small fire, staring at the flicker of flame, her mind a battlefield. Memories of fists and slamming doors echoed in her bones, warring with the new images. Her boy's small hands gripping rope under steady guidance. Her daughter's hair ruffled by a hand that did not strike. She told herself not to be fooled, that all men carried violence in their shadows. Yet her heart betrayed her, trembling whenever she thought of the softness in his eyes. Her husband felt it before she admitted it. He sensed the change in her, the way her silence was no longer only fear, but something else. His jealousy was a storm, black and swift. His hand fell heavier, his voice sharper. He spat the words at her, claiming her as his possession, swearing no man would ever take what belonged to him. He raged louder, drank deeper, his eyes turning wild when the cowboy's name was spoken in town. And the cowboy, though he said little, could not escape the whispers. In the saloon, men spoke low, shaking heads. They had seen her bruises, heard her muffled cries through thin cabin walls. They did not intervene, for the world was cruel, and people turned their faces from what they could not change. But he listened, and his jaw tightened, his silence heavier than before. Her days became darker. Each kindness from the cowboy was matched by cruelty at home. Each act of gentleness she tried to hide became a wound when discovered. Her body carried the burden, but her spirit reached a breaking point. One night, when the blows rained down harder than before, when her strength faltered and she felt her body slipping close to collapse, she did not weep. Instead, a whisper rose within her, not in words, but in the steady ache of her heart. Perhaps there was another way. Perhaps life did not have to be only endurance. Perhaps her children deserved more than a mother who simply survived. As she lay in the dark afterward, her body trembling, she fixed her eyes on the ceiling beams and let the whisper settle deep inside her bones. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine the possibility of another life. A life where a hand did not strike. A life where silence was not fear, but peace. And though her husband snored heavy beside her, though the night pressed cruel against the windows, the thought did not leave her. It flickered faintly, fragile as the flame of a candle, but it burned nonetheless. The night came down heavy, thicker than tar, and the storm inside the cabin was worse than any thunder that ever shook the prairie. His anger struck like iron, fists and boots against her body, words jagged and cruel. She bore it the way she always had, shielding the children with her silence, her arms wrapping around them when she could, her back taking the blows when she could not. But this time her body would not rise as it once did. She tasted blood, felt her strength slipping into the dirt floor, and knew that if she stayed, Don might never find her alive. When at last he collapsed into drunken sleep, she gathered what little remained of her strength. She woke the children with the gentleness of a whisper, urging them to follow, urging them not to make a sound. Their eyes widened with fear, but they obeyed, clutching her skirts as they crept out into the night. The air was cold, the prairie stretching endless under a moon pale and sorrowful. Her steps faltered, her ribs screaming with every breath, but still she pressed forward. Each step was a prayer, each stumble a plea that the land would not swallow them before safety could be found. The wind carried her collapse. She fell to her knees in the tall grass, her arms still around the children, her body trembling with exhaustion. And it was there that another shadow emerged, tall against the moonlight. The horse came first, snorting softly, and then the man, the cowboy. His eyes caught the sight of her, broken in the grass, children clinging to her torn skirts, and he moved as though his heart had been waiting for this moment all his life. He bent down, his hands careful, hesitant, as though she were glass about to break. She flinched even then, fear reflexive, but his voice was low, steady, carrying no demand. "I'll be gentle every step," he murmured as he lifted her. His arms were strong, but not with force, with steadiness, with protection. He carried her as though she were something sacred, something not to be touched by pain again. The children followed, small feet stumbling, but he lifted them onto his horse, gathering them close. The prairie swallowed them whole as he led them back to his cabin, his stride unyielding, his silence heavy with promise. Days slipped by in quiet. The cabin was plain, sturdy, built from his own hands, and it became their shelter. He did not fill the air with words. He did not press her to speak, did not ask for thanks, did not demand her story. He simply gave her space. Food was left at her side of the table. A blanket folded at the edge of the bed he offered her and the children. He made a fire each night, the warmth steady, asking nothing in return. The children adjusted first. They watched him with wide eyes, cautious at first, then curious, then delighted when he showed them small things: how to hold a fishing rod, how to sit tall in a saddle, how to whistle through a blade of grass. Their laughter grew in bursts, startling at first, then freer with each passing day. The sound filled the cabin like sunlight pushing through shutters. She watched from a corner, heart trembling. Every act of his stirred a battle within her. How could a man's hands teach instead of strike? How could his eyes soften at her children's joy instead of narrowing with annoyance? Each moment chipped away at the walls she had built, and though she told herself not to hope, her breath grew easier, her steps less burdened by fear. She caught herself once, standing in the doorway, simply breathing the air without waiting for a shout to follow. It felt like learning to live again. One evening, as the sun melted into gold behind the hills, the children tumbled in with laughter, still clinging to them. He had been showing them how to braid rope, and her daughter told story in such a silly way that the woman could not help it. A sound slipped from her lips, light and unplanned. A laugh. Small but true. She froze, startled by her own voice, as though it belonged to someone else. Her hand rose to her mouth, ashamed of the sound, afraid it might summon cruelty, as it always had before. But the cowboy looked at her, as if it was the most precious music in all creation. He said nothing, only let his eyes rest on her like the sun rests on the earth. And for the first time in years, she did not feel ashamed of her joy. That night she sat by the fire with the children, sharing bread and listening to the cowboy tell a story in his low, quiet voice. The fire painted shadows across the walls, and for a fleeting moment, she felt what it might mean to belong somewhere safe. But the world beyond those cabin walls was not blind. Her husband discovered soon enough that she had fled, that she had found shelter in another man's home. His pride burned hotter than any affection he had ever known. In the saloon, his rage spilled out with every drink, every clenched fist upon the table. He spoke of how she was his, how no man would take her away. He gathered others to his side, men eager for violence, men who fed on another's fury. Word traveled like wildfire. The cowboy heard it from a distance, the way one hears thunder long before the storm breaks. He said nothing to her, for she did not need to carry another fear. But his silence grew heavier, his eyes sharper, his movements more deliberate. He began mending the cabin walls, checking the rifle, making certain the children could ride without stumbling. He knew what was coming, even if the others pretended not to see. The nights became too still. The prairie air carried a tension, the kind that comes before lightning strikes. She sensed it, though no one spoke of it. She tucked the children into bed with extra care, humming longer, holding them tighter. Her heart wanted to believe that peace could last, that healing could bloom unthreatened. But deep inside, she felt the tremble of danger drawing near, like thunder rolling low over the plains. And so they lived in fragile peace, a family forming out of broken pieces, while the storm gathered strength just beyond the horizon. Dawn came heavy with smoke on the horizon, the kind of pale gray light that seemed to hold its breath before the world woke. The prairie grass bent beneath the weight of a rising wind, and with it came the sound of hooves. They were not gentle. They pounded the earth in a rhythm of anger, of men coming not to build but to destroy. Torches flickered like hungry mouths in the mist. At their head, her husband rode, his face twisted with something darker than rage, pride, possession, the fury of a man who saw control slipping through his calloused fingers. The cabin stood small against the endless plains, yet it did not bow. And neither did the cowboy who stood in front of it. He did not raise his weapon first. He simply planted his boots in the dirt and let the silence stretch. Behind him, the woman watched through the thin doorframe, her children clutching her skirts. For a moment, Fear wanted to drag her back into the dark corner where she had spent too many years. But the sight of him, broad shoulders squared, eyes calm like steady earth, planted something else in her chest. A pulse of defiance, faint but alive. The riders drew close, their laughter sharp. One man spat into the dust. Another raised his torch higher. The cruel husband sneered, his voice carrying on the wind. She's mine. Always been mine. No drifter, no orphan cowhand, no nothing man will take what belongs to me. The cowboy's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His silence was heavier than the threats around him. He didn't need many words. His presence spoke enough. But she knew the moment had come when silence would no longer be her shield. Her heart hammered. Her throat burned with years of words swallowed. She stepped out from behind the door, children still clutching her skirts. Every bruise on her body seemed to ache in the morning light. Every scar seemed to hum with memory. Yet she walked forward. The men jeered. Some muttered in surprise. The husband's face twisted when he saw her stand straight, her chin lifted, her voice trembling yet clear. No, I don't belong to you. I never did. The words cracked like a whip across the dawn. She spoke of nights spent hiding tears in her children's hair so they wouldn't see her break. She spoke of the fear she carried in her bones, the kind that silenced her, bent her, nearly erased her. She spoke of her children's laughter, how rare it had been, how precious. And she spoke of what they deserved, not a life of fists and fire, but one where love did not come sharpened like a blade. The husband cursed, raised his hand as if to strike her even across the distance, but it was too late. Something in the air had shifted. The cowboy stepped forward, not to speak for her, not to take her voice, but to stand beside it. His shadow stretched long beside hers, the two of them facing down cruelty with nothing more than truth and quiet strength. The husband shouted. Guns lifted. The air stilled. For a breathless second, dawn itself seemed to hesitate. Then violence erupted, not in endless carnage, but in a single moment that shattered years of chains. The husband lunged, pride blind and fists eager, but in his fury he left himself open. A shot rang out, not from the cowboy's hand, but from the trembling hand of one of the very men he had dragged along. The torchbearer who had seen too many nights of cruelty, who had whispered too many doubts. The bullet found its mark. The husband fell into the dust he had once ground her into. The torches dropped. The men scattered, their bravado dissolving into the mist. The storm ended almost as quickly as it began. Silence reclaimed the land. A silence unlike the heavy one of her past. This silence was clean, open, a space to breathe. She stood, chest heaving, staring at the man who had once chained her life. He was nothing now but another body swallowed by the prairie. She did not weep. She did not rage. She only breathed. The children were the first to laugh. Their laughter broke sharp and bright across the morning like sunlight after storm clouds. They ran into the open air, chasing each other barefoot through the grass, unafraid of shadows for the first time. She watched them, her heart aching with something unfamiliar, peace. Later, she sat on the cabin's porch. Her body still bore the bruises of yesterday, but her soul felt lighter. The cowboy sat beside her, not close enough to claim, not far enough to doubt. They did not speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer born of fear, but of safety, a language all its own. She looked at him once, saw the gentleness in his weathered eyes, and looked away, but not out of shame. For the first time, she could rest without flinching. And then, as the prairie stretched endless before them, the narrator's voice came soft, like wind through tall grass. It spoke not of fairy tales or grand romances, but of something harder, truer. Love, it said, was not a firestorm. It was not conquest, nor possession, nor fury disguised as passion. Love was a steady hand, a quiet shelter, a promise lived out one patient moment at a time. Perhaps we are all waiting, the voice whispered, for someone who does not strike, someone who says only, I'll be gentle every step. And so, beneath the wide dawn sky, the truth remained, carved into the dust and wind. In the wildest frontier, the greatest weapon was not cruelty, not steel, not fire. It was kindness. Always kindness.